All right, hello. We'll be talking today about Chapter 15 from AMSCO AP European History. Chapter 15, the political responses to industrialization. You all read in chapters 13 and 14 about the Industrial Revolution of the early to mid 1800s. That was chapter 13. And then chapter 14 was about how the Industrial Revolution affected people in their everyday lives. Chapter 15 focusing on politics, focusing on governments. In the first half of the 1800s, we'll focus on two key years, 1815 and 1848, and four key ideologies or new political beliefs of liberalism, conservatism, socialism, / communism, and nationalism. So these are going to be some of the symbols that we'll look at. Liberalism, conservatism, socialism, communism, nationalism, and we might touch on capitalism a little bit as well. So again, when we're looking at all of these are new political ideologies, new political beliefs that first appeared in the early 1800s. Think about the context real quick. So I've got my notes here set up for this, but I'm going to add some quick notes on the context. We're looking at the early 1800s. There are two main things that are happening right now. First, you have the Industrial Revolution. What does the Industrial Revolution do? Well, it drastically changes the lives of really everyone in Europe. And it also creates a lot of problems for the working class. Poverty, being overworked, abuse at work, is probably the simplest way to phrase it. And so some of these ideologies are in response to those problems of the Industrial Revolution. The other big thing that's going on in the early 1800s is you have the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1815. There had been 20 years or 15 years of war. Napoleon's finally defeated in 1815. And so some of these new political ideologies are attempts to deal with Napoleon and kind of his legacy. All right, four main political ideologies. The first is liberalism. Hopefully you see within the root of the root word of liberalism is liberal or liberty. In Spanish, libertad is freedom. Liberalism is all about individual freedoms. So liberalism, it says it first emerged during the Enlightenment. Think about John Locke talking about natural rights, or Voltaire talking about religious toleration. We also saw liberalism during the French Revolution. Think about the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, or Droit Remarque, that said that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. So liberalism really emphasizes individual rights and freedoms. Popular sovereignty, which you might remember is the government serving the people. When we're talking about context here, this is during the Enlightenment or during the French Revolution. It's first kind of popping up. And really any of those names, I mean, rights of individuals, that's John Locke. Popular sovereignty and the social contract, that's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So these are the ideas of the Enlightenment. And liberalism, perhaps not surprising, liberalism was most common in England. England, remember, was the most progressive, the most liberal country in Europe at this time. Remember, after the Glorious Revolution, the monarch or king had to share his power with Parliament. And we see some famous names there. John Locke, who talked all about natural rights. John Stuart Mill, who we'll read about in class shortly if we haven't already, talks about how individuals should have the freedom to do whatever they want as long as they do not harm another. The Declaration of Rights of Man says something similar. And Jeremy Bentham, another English philosopher, said law should be for the greater good. It should help all people become better in some sense. So there's one political ideology, liberalism, and we see this especially again in England. So there are a handful of things that we see where in England, the British government passes liberal reforms. They create liberal laws to help everyday people. First is the Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, 1844. This gradually grants universal male suffrage, which means every male now has the vote. That is absolutely liberalism because it's focusing on individual rights and limiting the power of the government. Now, before the British Parliament did that, there had been some attempts to pressure the British Parliament to do that. Most famously, what was called the Charters movement, or Chartism, where 2 to 3 million British people signed on to a petition, signed on to a charter, formally asking Parliament to give them the right to vote. You'll see in the notes here that the Chartist movement was ignored by Parliament at first, but obviously by 1884, all men have the vote, so eventually they got their wishes. It just took a little bit longer. And then there were also all sorts of government reforms to improve quality of life, I guess. We talked in chapter 13 and 14 about building sewers and the subway system. We talked about the Factory Act, or the 10 Hours Act, which limited how long children could work. There was a minimum wage that was established, or at least an increased wage. All of these are liberal reforms. It's emphasizing individual rights, the rights of people. It's also making the lives of everyday people better. And so if you're thinking about liberalism, kind of like the key idea here, maybe, we've got rights, we've got freedoms, and it's kind of like it's for everyone. It's not just for the powerful, it's for everyone. Liberalism will eventually become the dominant ideology by the time we get to the second half of the 1900s. But in the 1800s, the dominant ideology, I think, is probably conservatism. Conservatism, I mean, within the word conservative, if you want to conserve something, you want to keep it the way it is. You want to preserve it, or keep it, or protect it. And so the conservatism here, the goal of conservatism is to maintain traditions, basically. Maintain things the way they are. So in terms of government, that means they want to maintain monarchs and traditional rule. They want to maintain a balance of power to prevent one country from getting too powerful. And they want to suppress or put down any revolutions or liberal uprisings or things like that. Conservatism is born in 1815. It was created in 1815 after the fall of Napoleon. The Congress of Vienna was held in 1815. I'll add some notes on that at the bottom in a moment. Congress of Vienna was held in 1815 after Napoleon was defeated, to try to figure out, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? How do we prevent a superpower like France from ever getting power again? And so I'm actually going to scroll down here a little bit. Our two key political events of the early 1800s. First is the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Context, again, European countries have finally defeated Napoleon and France after about 10 years of war. And the goal here, again, is to restore traditional power and traditional balance of power, traditional authorities. And so the Congress of Vienna, this was Austria, England, Russia, and Prussia. So Austria, England, Russia, and Prussia. It was actually led by Austria, so I'm going to bold them. It was led by a guy named Clemens von Metternich, who we will read. We'll read an excerpt from him shortly. What did they do? Well, they put monarchs back on the throne. They suppressed liberal or democratic revolutions. And they redistributed land to have a balance of power, which means they wanted no more superpowers. They don't want France to be a superpower anymore. We're going to dig into the Congress of Vienna more in class next week. But again, the Congress of Vienna, that's the meeting held after they finally defeat Napoleon to try to restore traditional conservative power in Europe. And so how do they do that? Well, Austria, for example, Clemens von Metternich, he bans nationalist groups that might cause trouble, and he censors the press to prevent newspapers from being rabble-rousers or encouraging revolutions. What does Russia do? Well, the Tsar in Russia gains even more power. He resists any reforms that might causing stability. In France, what does Charles X do? Well, Charles X dissolves or gets rid of Parliament. He gets rid of the Estates General. He also censors the press. And so what we see here is that short-lived experiment of democracy from the French Revolution, it's failed, it's gone. And by 1815, monarchs are back on the throne throughout Europe. So let me actually add some key words here. I think that's probably helpful. Key ideas here, we have tradition, we have monarchs, and maybe we have balance of power. Actually, no, I'll keep that, and then I'll add stability as well. They want to maintain stability, preventing revolutions from causing trouble. All right, next up is socialism. Socialism is the people's response to the problems of the Industrial Revolution. And socialism is the opposite of an ideology called capitalism. I'm actually going to add a row here for capitalism because it's kind of its own thing. We talked about capitalism a little bit last week during the Industrial Revolution, but context of capitalism, this is the Industrial Revolution in England. The root of capitalism is capital, which means money. And what capitalism means is there is private ownership of property and of businesses, which means the government doesn't own things, you do. That means also the government is hands off. There's limited government control or regulation of the economy. Now, the goal of this, capitalism is sometimes called economic liberalism because people are free to do what they want. People are free to work where they want. They're free to invest the money how they see fit. They're free to pay their workers whatever they see fit. The problem is it benefits some, the rich get richer, but it also leads to inequality. It leads to poverty. It leads to the exploitation of the working class. So it leads to inequality, poverty, and exploitation of the working class. And so socialism emerges in response to that. So this is in response to the problems of the Industrial Revolution and the problems, I suppose, of capitalism in general. And the basic goal of socialism is that it is government's responsibility to promote general welfare, to help all people. And along with that, the means of production, wealth, should not be controlled by private citizens for personal profit. Rather, those means of production should be owned by the community for the public good or the general good. This is the exact opposite of capitalism, because in capitalism, this leads to immense wealth for the business owners, for the upper class, but it also leads to poverty. Rich get richer, poor get poorer. Socialism is saying, well, why should it have to be? Why doesn't the community own things instead and use those resources, use that wealth to uplift all people? One example of this in New Lanark, Scotland, was a small town created by Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a businessman. He was an investor who created his own town called New Lanark, Scotland, that was a socialist utopia. It was a socialist community. There were 8-hour workdays, free public education for all children, free daycare provided for all children, and it was truly run by the community. The community made decisions together, and the wealth of the factories was used to promote the general good, to pay for schools, to pay for healthcare, things like that. Now, this was just one community, just one town. It had actually only lasted for a couple of decades before it went bankrupt and they ran out of money. But this was a great example of how socialism could work. Community working together. Society, you see the root of socialism is social or society, society working together. So key ideas here, maybe we've got maybe cooperation, and we've got general welfare, helping all people in a community. Socialism is going to continue to be a significant political ideology, especially in the second half of the 1800s, but it also morphs and becomes a different ideology called communism. Communism was created in 1848 by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who were two Prussian historians and economists. And Karl Marx, just like scientists did during the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment, Karl Marx studied history. He studied conflicts, and he realized a handful of things. First, I'm looking at the second quote here. He said, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle." By that, he meant every single conflict in world history has been a conflict between the haves and the have-nots, the powerful and the powerless, the wealthy and the poor. And so he came to think, well, okay, if every single conflict is a conflict of class struggle, a class conflict, how do you solve that? How do you get rid of conflict? You get rid of wealth. You get rid of private property. That way everyone is equal, and then there would be no more conflict. He says in the second to last quote, "The theory of communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. If there is no more private property, if everything is owned by the community," the root of communism, community, everything's held in common, then there's no rich, there's no poor, there are simply the people. And along with socialism, the people can work to benefit the entire community and general welfare. The final line of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx wrote, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians are working class. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of all countries, unite." And so I'm going to add this under the socialism box, but it really, socialism kind of morphs into communism in 1848, created by Karl Marx. And his goal basically is that the working class, or the proletariats, need to gain something called class consciousness. They need to become aware of their power, aware of their influence, and basically rebel and overthrow the capitalist system. The goal of communism is shared property, shared wealth, run by the community. The goal truly is true equality. No rich, no poor, no upper class oppressing the working class. But he is really calling for a revolution here. He's calling for a workers' revolution. And so communism is going to inspire a lot of workers to rise up. It's never really going to take hold, but it'll become really a dominant ideology for the next 150 years, at least in the next 100 years or so in Europe and other parts of the world actually as well. This is Karl Marx up here. This is the hammer and the sickle. The hammer represents workers. The sickle represents peasants. It's all about all of lower class people, workers and peasants, coming together. A couple of memes. It's not about me, it's about we, all the people coming together. And communist memes aren't funny unless everyone gets them. Communism is all about every single person in a society or community getting the resources that they deserve, rather than just the wealthy. All right, our final political ideology or ism of the 1800s is nationalism. You see the root of nationalism is nation. And so this is all about having pride in your nation. Now, you might remember before this, there were some nations, England, France, Russia, but in a place like Germany or Italy, you might remember there were small states. Italy, there was no country of Italy. It was divided into Rome and the Papal States, Sicily, Florence, the state of Venice, etc. There was no united Germany. Instead, it was divided into hundreds of small German states. Prussia, Saxony, Brandenburg, Friedrich, etc. Nationalism is the idea that, well, maybe all of these small states, maybe we have something in common. We have a similar ethnic background, a similar language, a similar culture. And perhaps rather than being loyal to my city or my state, I should be loyal to my nation, the nation of Germany. And I should fight to strengthen my nation of Germany as much as possible. So the definition of nationalism is basically having a strong connection to your nation. Maybe that's the culture, maybe that's the language, maybe that's the history or something like that. And being loyal to your nation, above all else, willing to do anything for your nation, willing to go to war for your nation, willing to work whatever job they ask you to do for your nation. Nationalism, I should actually add here for context, sorry. Nationalism exists during the French Revolution of 1789. It was called fraternity, brotherhood. But nationalism really becomes a significant force during the wars of Napoleon. When Napoleon goes to war, when he conquers the German states and he conquers the Italian city-states, he inspires those people to fight back. People in the German states realize, well, why are we being ruled by a French emperor? We should rule ourselves. And so, let's see here, how do I want to write this? Napoleon's wars inspired conquered people, especially in Germany, to rise up and to fight for their own nation. The first significant example of this we see, at least post-Congress of Vienna, post-Napoleon, is Greece. Greece in 1821 rebelled against the Ottoman Empire, and Greece gained their independence. Now, what we'll see in a moment is that nationalist uprisings are oftentimes going to be suppressed. Go back to conservatism. They want to maintain a balance of power. They want to maintain stability. Nationalism inspires revolutions. It inspires revolts. And so what we're going to see with nationalism is this conflict between the people wanting to strengthen their nation and monarchs wanting to suppress those uprisings to maintain more stability. So I'm going to say here that it oftentimes inspired peoples to rebel, but it also kind of forced monarchs to suppress these nationalist uprisings in order to maintain stability. So again, much of the 1800s is this conflict between the people and the monarchs over really who has authority. So we'll explore this more in a moment. Okay, cool. This is the first half of this, so let's talk real quick. Again, context of all of this, we've got both the Industrial Revolution and the fall of Napoleon, and a handful of new ideologies. Liberalism is all about individual rights and freedoms for everyone. Conservatism is the exact opposite. So liberalism, conservatism are polar opposites. Conservatism is all about maintaining stability and a balance of power and keeping traditional sources of authority like monarchs, not the people. Capitalism is economic liberalism, if you will. It's all about people having the freedom to do what they want, no government control of regulation. That's what England has during the Industrial Rev. Socialism and communism, though, is a response to that. It's an attempt to solve the problems of the Industrial Rev. Shared wealth, promoting the general welfare, things like that. And then finally, we have nationalism, which doesn't fit into those other boxes quite as well. Nationalism is all about people being inspired to fight for their nation, which oftentimes means they're going to rise up and fight for their nation, which is going to cause quite a few troubles. All right, we're down to our political events of the early 1800s. We already know Congress of Vienna, 1815. That is when all of those liberal revolutions were suppressed. They were put down. And for the next 40 or so years, monarchs are going to be in power. And there's going to be an organization called the Concert of Europe. Concert can mean, going to see your favorite band perform. But if people do something in concert, that means they're working together. They're working in harmony. And so the Concert of Europe was basically an agreement between the big five: Austria, Prussia, Russia, England, and France. And the goal of this was to maintain stability, balance of power, and monarchs on the throne. So what would they do? They would suppress revolutions. They would suppress any challenge to the balance of power, the status quo, the way things were. The biggest conflict, or rather the last conflict or the last challenge to the Concert of Europe, was in 1848. When we talk about years, you have to know 1815, Congress of Vienna. You have to know 1848, the revolutions of 1848. For the last 30 years, from 1815 to 1848, Metternich and the Concert of Europe had reestablished conservative control across Europe and had suppressed liberal reforms. Monarchs were back on the throne. Revolutions were put down. Either liberal, socialist, or nationalist uprisings were put down. But the Industrial Revolution is in full force by 1848, and that brings all the problems associated with industrialization: unemployment, hunger, poverty, the oppression of the poor, and especially the poor realizing that they have a lack of representation. The poor realizing, the working class realizing they have no power. And so when we're talking about 1848, the context, we've got two things. First, the Concert of Europe has maintained a conservative control since 1815, but the Industrial Revolution has led to poverty for the working class, let's say. And so monarchs are just fine with the way things are because there's stability, but the working class is clearly going to be frustrated with how things are going. Okay, so you've got this context of conservatives in power, but the working class are frustrated. And what are the working class going to be inspired by? Well, all of those new ideologies are going to inspire the working class. So they're going to be inspired by the new ideologies. Liberalism tells them that they should have rights. Nationalism tells them they should unite as a people. Socialism tells them that that the government should serve them and attempt to benefit them. And so the working class begins to look around, and they begin to gain, as Karl Marx called for, they begin to gain class consciousness. Why don't we have these rights? Why isn't the government serving us? Why don't we just unite as a nation and take what is ours? So that will lead to revolutions in 1848. Most notably in France, although these revolutions will spread throughout Europe. And it is the working class that rise up. The working class are frustrated. There's unemployment. There's food shortages. The king is refusing to give them rights. I hope that sounds familiar. It's basically the exact same thing the Third Estate fought for in 1789. So we have France here. The working class and students, they rebel over unemployment, food shortages, and no power. I'm going to say a la 1789, similar to 1789. And so what do the workers do? They take to the streets. They create barricades in the streets. They take control of neighborhoods. And they force the king, Louis Philippe, to abdicate. They force the king to step down. And they force the government to create workshops to train workers on new skills and to provide work for the unemployed. These reforms don't last very long, and during what's called the June Days, there's a second round of rebellions, a second round of riots, where 10,000 workers riot because they don't have access to these workshops. Only the wealthy middle class, called the bourgeoisie, has access to these workshops. So I'm going to actually do kind of like cause and effect here. The cause is the working class and students rebel over unemployment, food shortages, no power. I'm going to have two effects here. First, whoops, the king steps down and they create workshops, which only benefit the bourgeoisie, that's the wealthy. And so the workers rebel again. And who gets put into power? Napoleon III, which I believe, if I'm remembering my timeline right, is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. And so the Revolution of 1848 is a failure. The working class does not get what they want. And we'll explore why in just a moment. Some photographs of the revolution, sorry, a painting of the Revolution of 1848. You can see the barricade in there, the people behind it. Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix. This is technically from 1830, the first round of revolution, but it works for 1848 as well. The people, the working class, what are they fighting for? They're fighting for liberalism, liberty, and they're fighting for nationalism, the nation of France, what's called the tricolore, which was the French flag. Remember, we talked about how there's that triangle that represents triumph, the people triumphant. And then an actual photograph of what those barricades looked like. There's not many photographs left from 1848 because cameras were very rare, but here's one, literally taking everything they could, rocks, wagons, pianos, tables, chairs, to create barricades in the streets to take control of neighborhoods. And zoomed in on that same photograph there. Side note, when Paris rebuilds itself, like we talked about in chapter 14, one of the reasons why they rebuild the entire city is to widen streets so that the citizens of France can no longer create barricades. So again, when France rebuilds itself, or sorry, when Paris rebuilt itself under Baron Haussmann, big, wide open avenues and streets, public spaces, it's to make things flow better, sure, but it's also to prevent workers from rebelling like they did in 1848. So ultimately, the revolutions of 1848 failed, kind of like the French Rev of 1789 failed as well. And it largely failed because the working class was fighting for certain things. The working class joined forces with students, and they joined forces with the bourgeoisie, the wealthy middle class. But once they got rid of the king, the bourgeoisie took all the power for themselves and ignored the working class. It says here the revolutions failed over divisions within Europe. Mainly the moderate, the bourgeoisie, the middle class. Once they got power, they said, cool, I'm good. I don't really care about helping the working class. I got what I wanted, and they ignored the working class. So it ultimately fails because of divisions within France. Specifically, once the bourgeoisie, which again is the wealthy middle class, gain power, they ignore the workers' demands. You can certainly predict that there's going to be future revolutions in 1871. The workers of Paris will take control of the city again in what's known as the Paris Commune. This revolution of 1848 fails in France, but it inspires other failed revolutions throughout Europe. And why did these revolutions fail? Well, they were suppressed by the concert of Europe. Remember, the whole point of the concert of Europe is to maintain stability and monarchs on the throne. So Austria swoops in and they suppress the revolution. France swoops in and they suppress the revolution to maintain stability. And so the revolution of 1848 is I don't know who said it, but some historian called it a turning point at which modern history failed to turn. The revolutions of 1848 should have been a massive turning point where the working class rose up, got rid of oppressive monarchs, and took power for themselves. It's what should have happened. But it didn't. all of these revolutions failed. These monarchs remained in power for another 70 years, I guess, until 1918. I'm going to throw this quote in here: a turning point at which modern history failed to turn. That meaning the workers should have won. Liberalism should have won. Nationalism should have won. But instead, conservative monarchs will still rule for another 70 years. These last two slides will just show us how widespread these revolutions were. Okay, we know that Paris has revolutions, but there were other revolutions throughout the German states, in Austria, Hungary, Italy, etc., spreading throughout Europe. And then I always like this political cartoon, because this political cartoon shows us the conservative response. What do? Well, they take their broom and they sweep up the rebellions, sweep them out and get them out of there. They take out their sword and they attack the workers, they attack the people. And so this political cartoon really shows us the conservative order monarchs suppressing those revolutions. And so to wrap things up here, kind of big idea of these two things, and I'm going to add this maybe off in the left here. Congress of Vienna, what's the big idea here? Well, conservatives regain power in Europe, and that's going to last for until 1914, until World War I, for 100 years. Big idea or big ideas of the revolutions of 1848. I'm going to throw a few in here. What are the big ideas of these revolutions? Workers rebel, and they're inspired by those new isms: liberalism, socialism, and nationalism. But they fail as monarchs restore their power in the end. All right, there was quite a bit of information here. Hopefully you already got the first half of notes, but I'll scroll up here, pause if you need to. Our new ideologies. A little bit we missed on nationalism at the bottom there. And then the political events of the 1800s.